Some women hold a kind of silence that speaks louder than begging ever could. And men, they feel it, even when they can't explain it. Especially when they can't explain it. You're not the one who yells. You're the one who disappears into yourself when you're done explaining things that never should have had to be explained. And suddenly, he can't stop thinking about you. It's not your beauty. Not just that. It's something else, something he couldn't quite touch until you took it away. That something is what Jung called animus, but what you might recognize as your inner fire. Not the version that burns hot and wild, but the one that simmers beneath the surface. Quiet, controlled, undeniable. The kind of energy that doesn't beg to be understood, because it already knows its own worth. If you've ever found yourself wondering why a man pulled away, then circled back later, obsessed, even after it seemed like he didn't care, this is for you. If you've ever silenced your needs, just to keep the peace. If you've ever been the one who loved harder, gave more, until you were left empty. But then, something inside you changed. You stopped chasing. You stopped apologizing for your depth. And that's when he noticed you again. Not the version of you who overgave, but the version who walked away without slamming the door. This episode is not about tricks or games. It's about power. Emotional power. The kind that doesn't look loud. The kind that doesn't perform. The kind that haunts a man. Not because you wanted him to ache, but because your energy awakened something in him that wasn't ready before. But now it is. So if you've ever been the woman who feels too much, who's been told she's intimidating or too much to handle, but secretly suspects that she's just been misunderstood, stay here, because this conversation was meant for you. Before we go on, take a breath with me, a real one. This is not background noise. This is where things begin to click. And if what you're hearing already speaks to something you've lived through or are living through right now, you might want to subscribe, so this space finds you again when you need it. Because healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in echoes. Ready. You may not have had the words for it at the time, but somewhere deep in your body you knew. The moment you stopped chasing him, the moment you stopped over-explaining, over-giving, over-feeling for both of you, something shifted. You didn't just stop calling. You reclaimed yourself. And that's when the obsession began, not because you withheld love, but because you finally gave it back to the person who needed it most. You. Men don't obsess over women who try to be easy. They don't lose sleep over women who give all their softness up front, hoping it'll earn them care in return. They don't feel haunted by the woman who made herself small just to fit into the corner of his chaos. But they do come undone over the woman who chooses herself, even when it breaks her heart, because there's an energy in that choice that cannot be faked. This energy doesn't come from bitterness. It doesn't come from manipulation. It comes from grief, the kind of grief that grows you, the kind that cracks your spine open and teaches you to stand taller in your own skin. Most men are not ready for that kind of woman, but they remember her. God, do they remember her? She becomes the one they compare others to, without realizing it. She becomes the one they can't laugh off, can't shrug away, can't outgrow. And it isn't because she did anything to stay in his mind. It's because she left while still loving herself. You see, men are used to being chased. They're used to being forgiven too easily, to being told, it's okay when it's not, to having their wounds bandaged by the very woman they're wounding. But when a woman stops playing nurse to his emotional chaos and starts tending to her own, it does something to him. He can feel it, even if he can't explain it. It starts as confusion. Why is she quieter? Why didn't she text back? Why does her energy feel so different? Then it turns to restlessness. He checks your page. He rereads old messages. He wonders if you're talking to someone else, if you're done for good, if you meant it when you said goodbye without theatrics. And eventually, it turns into obsession, not always loud, not always visible, but consuming. The kind that makes him replay the last time he saw you, looking for signs he missed. The kind that makes him remember how your eyes didn't flinch when you walked away. You weren't playing hard to get. You were done making it hard to be gotten. There's a difference. One is a game. The other is a reckoning. And what Carl Jung knew, what so many miss, is that obsession doesn't come from charm. It comes from the activation of something buried. When a man meets a woman who has integrated her fire and her softness, her boundaries and her compassion, he meets a mirror he can't look away from. She reflects both what he desires and what he fears. because she doesn't need him to feel whole. But she chose him for a while, and nothing is more haunting to the masculine psyche than being chosen and then released. When that happens, a man is forced to confront the parts of himself he's spent years avoiding. You didn't wound him by leaving. You woke him up. There's a certain kind of woman who doesn't just walk out of a man's life, she walks back into herself. And when she does, he feels it. Not in the way a boy misses a toy he lost, but in the way a man misses a home he abandoned before he ever really understood what it meant to feel safe. This woman doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't slam doors. She lets the silence do what her words couldn't could. And here's what that silence says. I love you, but not more than I love me. I hoped you'd show up, but I won't keep waiting. I see your pain, but I won't drown in it with you. It's the kind of quiet that echoes in his mind when everything else has gone still. There's a truth Jung pointed to that rarely gets said out loud. The unconscious pulls us toward the people who reveal what we've disowned in ourselves. So when a man meets a woman who holds her own depth, who feels fully without folding, who isn't trying to be understood because she already understands herself, he meets the part of himself he's been too afraid to touch. And that's where the obsession begins. Not with her looks, not with her laugh, with her energy, with what her presence activated in him. She didn't need to convince him. She didn't try to prove her worth. She just was. And that lingers in his bloodstream like a memory that doesn't know how to die. Even if he moves on, even if he distracts himself with someone more available, more agreeable, more easy, that other woman won't hold the same charge. Because the one who knew how to see him without losing herself, she burned a permanent shape into his idea of love. You see, the energy that captivates men isn't just feminine softness. It's not just tenderness and warmth. It's the edge of the woman who knows what she'll no longer accept. It's her restraint, her ability to sit in discomfort, her refusal to explain again what he should have listened to the first time. It's the quiet confidence of a woman who would rather be alone than confused. She is not punishing him by being absent. She is healing herself by not returning to what made her question her own clarity. And he can feel that. The thing is, most men don't realize what they had when they had it. Because it's easy to overlook grace when you've never had to earn it. It's easy to mistake calm for compliance. It's easy to take advantage of softness when you think it's endless. But when that softness disappears, when the woman who used to lean in leans back, that's when he starts to question everything. Not because she wants him to suffer, not because she planned this, but because her absence became a mirror. And in that mirror, he finally sees himself. Not the version he showed her, but the version he became in her presence, the parts he avoided, the patterns he kept repeating, the words he never said, the love he never knew how to hold. And the haunting truth? She saw it all. She stayed for longer than she should have. And then, with grace, she let go. That's what makes her unforgettable. Some men spend years trying to replace the feeling she gave them. Not the attention, not the affection, the feeling. The feeling of being met without being fixed. The feeling of being witnessed, fully, and still desired. The feeling of being called forward, not controlled. Because she didn't try to change him. She simply saw more in him than he saw in himself, and loved him as if he could rise into it. But love like that comes with weight, and not every man is ready to carry it. So instead of rising, he ran. He chose the familiar over the expansive. He chose comfort over confrontation. He chose something easier, someone easier. And for a while, he might even convince himself he's happy. But deep in the quiet moments when the noise fades and the pretending thins out, her memory surfaces. Not because she's waiting, but because the version of himself that almost emerged in her presence is still lingering, unfinished. See, this kind of woman doesn't just make an impression, she initiates something irreversible. He may have forgotten the sound of her voice, but he remembers how she made him feel like he could be more. Not by pushing him, not by pleading, but by being more herself. That's the paradox. The more she stood in her truth, the more he was invited into his. And the further he strayed from her, the more hollow his life began to feel. Because when a man loses a woman rooted in her own energy, a woman who doesn't chase, who doesn't prove, who doesn't shrink, he loses the mirror that showed him who he could have been. That's why it's obsession, not regret. Regret fades. Obsession lingers. It doesn't matter how many years pass. He could be married. He could be successful. He could be surrounded by everything he once said he wanted. But if he never met himself the way she once met him, he'll always feel a gap. Not in her absence, but in the absence of who he was becoming when she was around. That's the core of it. Men don't obsess over the women who fill their ego. They obsess over the women who touch their potential. The ones who didn't stay to fix them. The ones who walked away when they realized the man they loved wasn't ready to love himself. So if you're that woman, if you've ever left quietly, not because you stopped loving him, but because you started loving, you don't doubt your impact. Even if he never says a word, even if he never comes back, somewhere in his mind, you live rent-free not because you demanded it, but because you earned it. Through your strength, through your softness, through the silence that followed your goodbye. That kind of woman is never forgotten. There's a reason you felt invisible in the moments you gave the most. Because you were trying to be enough in a space that couldn't receive you. And the moment you stopped trying, the moment you stopped offering pieces of yourself just to keep things calm, he felt it like a shift in the air. That's the strange ache most men don't have words for. It's not her perfume they miss, not her voice. It's the gravity she carried when she chose herself. Most men don't realize what real intimacy feels like until it's no longer freely given. They confuse availability with affection. They confuse consistency with need. But the woman who was there not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of love, she changes the equation. Because when she finally chooses distance, it doesn't come from anger. It comes from truth. That's what wrecks him, not the absence of her body, the absence of her belief in him. He didn't just lose a girlfriend. He lost the one person who looked at his chaos and still saw the man beneath it. And here's where the obsession deepens. She never begged to be chosen. She never fought to be heard. She walked when staying would have meant betraying herself. And somehow, that's what made him listen. There's something haunting about a woman who doesn't explain her worth, who doesn't weaponize silence, but instead uses it as a boundary, who doesn't threaten to leave, but simply does when love is no longer a safe place to rest. That's a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't roar, the kind that whispers, "I'm done." Jung believed that we're drawn to people who embody the missing parts of our psyche, that what we obsess over isn't always the person, it's what they awoke inside us. So when a man loses a woman with this kind of presence, what he really loses is access to the version of himself that only ever existed around her. She didn't complete him. She called to him. And now, without her, he can't find that same call anywhere else. Sure, others will come. Others always do. But their love will feel lighter. Their energy won't press on his soul the same way. Their absence, if it comes, will not echo. Because the echo only comes from the love that asked for nothing but presence and was still left unheard. You weren't a lesson. You were a chance to meet himself at the edge of something real. And if he wasn't ready, that's not your burden to carry. But it is the reason he thinks about you at night. It's the reason he wonders what would have happened if he'd just said what he never had the courage to say. You didn't leave a hole in his life. You left a map to a version of himself he may never find again. There's a woman every man remembers, but rarely speaks of. Not because she hurt him, but because she healed a part of him he didn't know was broken until she was gone. She didn't fix him. She didn't try. She simply loved with a presence so whole, so rooted, that he couldn't hide in his patterns the way he used to. And when she left, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with clarity. That's what left the mark. Because when a man experiences that kind of clarity in another human being, when he sees someone love without losing themselves, it creates a ripple in his soul. He might try to deny it, might bury himself in distraction, in noise, in busyness, might surround himself with people who never ask him to rise, might laugh it off with his friends, pretend he's good. But the truth lingers in quiet moments. When he's staring at his ceiling late at night, when he hears a song he didn't know reminded him of her, when he sees someone in a crowd who moves the way she used to, shoulders relaxed, eyes carrying that familiar depth, and it hits him, again, that she never asked him to be perfect. She just needed him to be present. But he couldn't be not fully, because the parts of him she loved the most were the ones he'd never made peace with. She saw his tenderness before he learned it was safe to show it. She saw his fear before he could name it. She saw his potential while he was still running from it. And when she left, she didn't just disappear. She left the door open. Not for him to return, but for him to finally enter himself. That's what makes her unforgettable. She didn't love him because he had it all together. She loved him where he was, but she didn't stay where she wasn't met. And that balance, that rare alchemy of love and boundaries, it became the blueprint for the kind of connection he didn't know he was starving for. You may not know how deeply you changed him, because he may never tell you. But energy doesn't lie. Somewhere, on some level, he carries you still. Not because you stayed, but because you had the courage to leave. And even if he never reaches out, never finds the words, there will be a part of him that remembers how it felt to be seen by someone who didn't flinch at his wounds, who didn't shrink to make him comfortable, who didn't ask him to become more, but held him to the more she already saw in him. The truth is, obsession isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like scrolling your old messages at 2 a.m. Sometimes it looks like chasing the same high in every new connection, never quite finding it. Sometimes it looks like silence, but inside, a storm. That storm is the cost of proximity to realness, to depth, to love that asks you to wake up. You weren't just a chapter. You were the book that made him realize the story he'd been living was too small. There's a grief men don't speak of, not because they can't, but because it demands a language they never learned. A language of feeling, of truth, of looking in the mirror without flinching. And that's the kind of grief you left him with, not because you were cruel, but because you were the first person who didn't need him to be more, you needed him to be real. And real was the one thing he hadn't practiced being. So he fumbled, pulled away, shrunk, not out of malice, but out of muscle memory. Because most men aren't taught to stay. They're taught to chase, to win, to conquer. But staying, being still inside discomfort, that's not something you win, that's something you choose. And he didn't know how to choose it. Not yet. But you did. You chose your silence over your suffering. You chose peace over potential. You chose healing over holding it all together. And you did it without punishing him. That's what he'll remember. Not your anger, your absence, not the things you said, the way you stopped saying anything at all. He'll remember the day your energy changed. The day you didn't text back right away. The day your laugh didn't reach your eyes. The day you didn't ask if he'd eaten, if he was okay, if he still cared. He'll remember that shift, not as drama, but as dignity. And the hardest part? He'll realize you were always enough. He just wasn't ready for the kind of love that doesn't cling. The kind that says, if I'm not met here, I'll meet myself. That kind of love doesn't chase. It chooses. And when it's no longer chosen in return, it leaves with grace. Not for attention, not for revenge, but because staying would mean self-betrayal. And he will feel that forever. Even if he finds someone new, even if he creates a life that looks complete, there will be a part of him that remains unfinished. A room in his heart with your name on it, filled not with longing, but with memory. The memory of how safe it felt to be seen, how terrifying it was to be known, how easy it was to be loved, until he had to love back. You were a mirror, not a muse. You didn't just inspire, you revealed. And that's what men remember when the noise settled. They remember the woman who didn't ask for anything they weren't already carrying. They remember the woman who knew who she was before they could tell her. They remember the woman who stayed long enough to try and left when trying became survival. And they remember her not because she was perfect, but because she was true. He might see your face in strangers for years, not in the way people hope or fantasize, but in the way that cuts softly, unexpectedly, when the light hits someone just right, or a laugh trails the same way yours used to. Not because he's chasing ghosts, but because the version of him that lived when he was with you hasn't been found again. He could be driving, radio on, sky bruised with twilight, and your name will rise in him like a song he forgot he loved. Not because he wants to go back, but because a part of him never left. It's not about what you did. It's about who you were when you were with him. You showed up like a woman who knew her value, even when it ached. You didn't hold love like a weapon. You held it like a gift. And when it wasn't held back, you let it go. That kind of departure doesn't leave a wound. It leaves a lesson, one that can't be shaken off, no matter how many distractions he stacks between now and then. Because obsession doesn't just come from loss. It comes from awakening. He wasn't just thinking about you. He was thinking about the man he could have become if he'd just stayed, if he'd listened, if he'd met you at the depth you offered him. But he didn't. And now, he'll compare every hand he holds to the steadiness of yours. Every argument to the calm you brought. Every kiss to the quiet knowing in your eyes when you said, "I'm not going to chase you." They won't match. Not because no one else is worthy, but because you didn't give him love laced with fear. You gave him something fearless. And that's the kind of love that men can't forget because they didn't have to earn it with lies or masks. They were simply asked to show up, raw. You knew what you were offering. That's the part he never admitted out loud. He knew you were different. He just wasn't ready for different. Different doesn't beg. It doesn't play small. It doesn't twist itself into shapes for someone's comfort. Different says, "Here I am. You can meet me, or you can go." You didn't abandon him. You stood where your soul could breathe. And he didn't come. That's not on you, but it will live in him in the quiet, in the almosts, in the way he avoids certain streets or songs because they feel too much like your memory. Not everyone gets remembered like that. But the woman who walks away with her worth intact, she never really leaves. Somewhere, maybe tonight, he's telling someone new that he doesn't believe in the one. And he means it, or wants to, but his heart knows better. Because he met someone once who didn't need to be the one. She just needed to be herself. And somehow, that was enough to shake his entire foundation. He didn't fall in love with her perfection. He fell in love with the way she held space for both his chaos and his softness. With how she didn't need to be saved, how she just was, even when things fell apart. It's hard to forget someone who gave you the space to be your whole self, and then chose to leave when you only gave her half. And he will try to replace that presence. Not out of cruelty, but out of longing. He'll seek it in smiles, in bodies, in voices. But it won't land the same, because real doesn't compete. It leaves a signature in the soul. She didn't make herself unforgettable by being louder. She made herself unforgettable by being honest. And honesty, when received too late, feels like loss. He didn't just miss out on a relationship. He missed out on a different path entirely. A life with someone who wouldn't let him numb out, who would call him forward, who would hold his hand without letting him drag her into his storms. That kind of woman doesn't hover in the past like a ghost. She becomes something else, something much more real. She becomes the moment he realized what love could have been. Not dramatic, not disparate, not draining, just true. The obsession he feels. It isn't about getting her back. It's about wishing he could go back to the version of himself that was possible when he was with her. But that version required work, required showing up, required saying, "I'm scared," instead of running. And he didn't know how, so he lost her. Not because she was too much, but because she was finally enough for herself. She didn't wait for him to catch up. She didn't pause her growth for his comfort. And that's what men remember. Not the ones who begged them to stay, but the ones who walked when staying meant abandoning themselves. If you're that woman, know this. Your power wasn't in how long you stayed. It was in how deeply you loved without losing your name. He may never say it, but you are the chapter he reopens when the world gets quiet. The energy he chases in others, without knowing he's chasing you. There's no closure in a story that ends in silence, only echoes. And that's what you became to him, not a closed book, but an unfinished sentence. He tells himself he's moved on, that what you two had was just timing, just chemistry, just something he wasn't ready for. And maybe that's true. But readiness isn't always the reason we lose something real. Sometimes we lose it because we never believed we could keep it. You didn't ask him for more than he could give. You simply stopped accepting less than you deserved. And there's a kind of power in that shift that unsettles the ones who never expected you to leave. They were used to your loyalty, your softness, your staying, but they never truly saw your edge until they met it. It's a quiet edge, not sharp, not cruel, but final. That's what shook him. Not your departure, but your certainty. He kept thinking there'd be another chance. That maybe, like before, you'd soften, you'd reach out, you'd keep that little door open. But something in you had changed. It wasn't that you stopped loving him. It was that you started loving yourself more than the idea of potential. And that decision, that's what haunts a man. Not because you were punishing him, but because you finally stopped negotiating your value. The truth he doesn't say out loud is this. You were the only one who made him want to become more. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence made mediocrity feel unbearable. You held him in ways that were unfamiliar, terrifying, liberating. And now, nothing feels quite as deep. Nothing feels quite as true. Not because he hasn't found love again, but because he hasn't found a love that mirrors back the man he wants to become. And that's the gift and the grief you gave him. You were both the sanctuary and the storm, the home he wanted, and the one he couldn't stay in without burning it down. So now, he carries you, in the way he hesitates before he lies, in the way he hears your voice when he wants to shut down, in the way he looks for depth in people who smile easily but don't ask the hard questions. He doesn't miss you. He misses who he was with you. And that's why he obsesses. Because in a world full of masks, you didn't wear one. And now he knows what real looks like. He may never say your name again. Not out loud. Not where others can hear. But he speaks it in the way he hesitates when asked what he wants. In the pause before he says he's happy. In the hollow between one woman's touch and the next. You became the rhythm of his unspoken questions. Not because you haunted him, but because you awakened something in him that he never dared to name. A hunger for honesty, a craving for connection that didn't come with conditions, a desire to be known, deeply, messily, without disguise. And even though he wasn't ready to rise into that man, he felt what it was like to stand next to a woman who already had. You were not an escape, you were a mirror, and mirrors don't bend. They reflect what's there without judgment, without mercy. He didn't run because you were too much. He ran because he saw himself, and he didn't like what he saw. But now, every time he meets someone new, he finds himself comparing energies. Not faces, not smiles, energy. And energy doesn't lie. No matter how much someone might try to mimic the way you listened, or how you held space, or the way your silence could hold a room still, they won't feel like you, because they weren't you. The you who didn't need to speak to make him feel understood. The you who didn't manipulate, didn't perform. The you who left, not to teach him a lesson, but to stop forgetting your own worth. That kind of woman isn't replaced. She's remembered, quietly, painfully, forever. You may never hear from him again. He might live a life that looks full, smiles in pictures, plans vacations, builds routines. But deep in the blueprint of his heart, there's a part of him that still checks for the shape of you, still wonders what might have happened if he'd leaned in instead of pulling away, if he'd answered instead of avoided, if he'd asked the questions instead of filling the silence with excuses. But he didn't, and now he knows what he lost. Not a perfect woman, not a fantasy, but a force, a presence that asked nothing of him, except truth. And the day he couldn't meet you there, that's the day you left. Not with noise, not with revenge, but with peace. And that peace, that's what men obsess over. The kind they only find when they lose someone who loved them enough to let them go. He thought the memory would fade, that time would dull it, that distance would soften it, that new faces, new rhythms, new laughter would eventually blur yours. But what he didn't realize is this: Real doesn't fade, it embeds, not in the obvious ways, not in fireworks and anniversaries and staged photos, but in the body, in the stillness, in the moments when nothing is loud and everything suddenly feels too quiet. That's where you live now, in the weightless pause before he replies to a message that doesn't move him, in the breath he holds when he thinks he sees you across the room but knows it can't be, in the ache he feels when he tells himself he's fine, and something inside him doesn't believe it. He didn't expect that loving you and losing you would turn him inside out, but it did, because you weren't just another chapter. You were the turning point, the moment the story could have changed, and he let it slip, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't believe he was worthy of the kind of love that doesn't flinch, the kind that stays, even when it's hard, the kind that looks you in the eyes and says, I see everything, and I'm still here. That was you, and now, you're gone. He might be surrounded by people who make fewer demands, people who don't challenge his patterns, don't press into his shadows, don't ask him to show up with anything more than charm and convenience. But he'll feel the lack. He'll feel it when conversations feel shallow, when touches feel forced, when connection feels like performance instead of presence, because you ruined him in the best way. You showed him what real feels like. Not perfect, not easy, just real. And now, anything less feels like pretending. You weren't a fantasy, you were a standard. Not the kind he can fake his way through, the kind he has to rise to. But that opportunity, it passed. You gave him chances. You gave him time. You gave him grace. And then, when grace became self-abandonment, you gave yourself the closure he wouldn't. That's why he obsesses. Not because you left suddenly, but because you left fully, with no pieces of yourself left behind for him to feed on. And in that emptiness, he's met with the truth. You were never asking him to be more. You were inviting him to remember that he already was. But he chose the lie. And now, he can't stop thinking about the woman who saw through it and loved him anyway. So here he is, maybe months later, maybe years, still haunted. Not by what you did, but by what he didn't do. He didn't show up. He didn't say the thing. He didn't meet you at the level you were already living on. And now, no matter how far he runs, he keeps coming back to the place where he first felt seen. You. You were the storm and the shelter. You were the question he never learned how to answer. The one who asked for truth just by being yourself. He may never tell anyone, may never even admit it to himself. But there's a corner of his heart where your name still echoes. And not because you yelled it into his life. You whispered it into his soul, through patience, through boundaries, through the terrifying power of walking away with your head held high. He thought you'd be like the rest. He thought you'd come back. He thought he had time. But you were never playing games. You were playing for keeps, and when you realized he wasn't ready, you didn't punish him. You released him. And somehow, that freedom tasted like loss. Because love like yours doesn't wait in doorways. It moves forward. You loved him from your whole heart. You left him from your healed one. And the man who couldn't rise to meet you then, he's still chasing the energy you carried. He may search for it in others. He may try to recreate it with someone new. He may even tell himself he's over it. But you can't unfeel real. And he felt you, so deeply, so silently, so fully. It carved something open in him. Maybe he'll grow. Maybe he'll change. Maybe, one day, he'll become the man you always saw in him. But by then, you'll be long gone. Not bitter, just free. Because the woman who knows her worth never stays where her presence is mistaken for convenience. She doesn't scream to be seen. She leaves, and lets her absence speak for itself. If you are that woman, or becoming her, know this: you didn't lose him. He lost the mirror that showed him who he could have been. And that never goes away. Thank you for being here, really here. If something in this spoke to your soul, stay connected. Subscribe, share, or simply come back when your heart needs the reminder. Your presence is your power. Your absence is your proof. And your truth, it never goes unnoticed.